My name is Victor. I'm 38 years old, a senior operations manager at a mid-sized tech firm most people in my city would recognize but never truly understand. On paper, I'm the dependable one, the calm executor, the man who makes sure other people's big ideas don't collapse under their own ambition. If you met me in the office cafeteria, you probably wouldn't look twice. I don't dominate conversations. I don't posture in meetings. I don't need to be the loudest voice in the room to feel secure. Over the years, that temperament earned me a reputation: reliable, steady, low drama, the kind of person you give responsibility to but not necessarily credit. And for a long time, I was comfortable with that. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about exposing villains or watching empires burn. It's about something quieter, more unsettling. It's about the morning my CEO called an all-hands meeting and announced that I was the reason the company lost millions. I remember the fluorescent lights, the faint hum of the projector, the way people shifted in their chairs when my name appeared on the slide behind him. There was no hesitation in his voice, no uncertainty, just a clean, surgical statement: operational failure, oversight, financial impact. The problem was, I had no idea I was even involved in that deal until it became a public accusation. In that moment, I didn't feel rage. I didn't feel the urge to stand up and defend myself. What I felt was something colder. A realization that this wasn't about a mistake. It was about positioning, about narrative, about who people expect to carry the weight when something goes wrong. This story is about how I got there. It's about the small dismissals that seem harmless until they accumulate. The meetings where your input is acknowledged but never adopted. The subtle reassignment of responsibility when outcomes turn inconvenient. It's also about what happens when someone you've underestimated decides to stop absorbing impact. I won't dramatize what happened. I won't exaggerate motives. I'll tell you exactly how I experienced it. The confusion, the clarity, the quiet shift inside me that changed the trajectory of my career and, honestly, my identity. Because sometimes dominance isn't loud. It doesn't slam doors or flip tables. Sometimes it's simply the decision to stop playing the role you were assigned. And once you make the decision, the consequences unfold without shouting. Have you ever sat in a room where your name was spoken as a problem and realized no one had ever asked you for your version of the truth? Before that meeting, before my name was projected 10 feet high against a white wall, I was the safe pair of hands. That's how they saw me. At 38, I had been with the company for almost 9 years. In tech years, that's a lifetime. I'd watched us move from a cramped co-working space with exposed brick and optimism to a glass-walled office overlooking downtown. I was there when we closed our first 7-figure contract. I was there when we nearly missed payroll one winter, and no one outside the executive team ever knew. But I was never the face of any of it. Publicly, I was introduced as Victor from Ops, not Victor, who redesigned our logistics pipeline and cut vendor waste by 18%. Not Victor, who caught the compliance error that would have triggered an audit. Just Victor from Ops, the operational backbone, necessary, but not visible. In meetings, I sat 2 seats away from the decision-makers, close enough to be useful, far enough to be peripheral. When a new initiative was announced, I was the one asked, "Can you make this work?" Not, "Should we do this?" The strategy happened above me. The execution settled on my desk. I didn't resent it, not at first. There's a quiet pride in being the stabilizer. While others chased recognition, I optimized systems. While they debated vision, I made sure invoices were paid, contracts were airtight, and timelines were realistic. I believed competence spoke for itself. The truth is, I was easy to underestimate. I don't interrupt. I listen longer than most people are comfortable with. When tensions rise, my voice lowers instead of climbing. Some people mistake that for passivity. It isn't. It's an observation. But in a fast-scaling company, observation doesn't trend on Slack. To the sales team, I was risk-averse. To product, I was detail-oriented to a fault. To leadership, I was dependable. It's a flattering word on the surface. Underneath, it means predictable, containable. There's a specific kind of invisibility that comes with being competent but not charismatic. You're trusted with complexity, but excluded from narrative. If something succeeds, it's because of bold leadership. If something struggles, it must have been operational friction. I noticed the pattern long before I admitted it. When quarterly wins were celebrated, The slides featured revenue graphs and client testimonials, the operational overhaul that made scaling possible, a bullet point. When mistakes were reviewed, the language subtly shifted downward. Execution gaps, process oversight, implementation lag. Those phrases live in my department. Still, I stayed quiet. Not out of fear, out of calculation, or so I told myself. I believed that over time, consistent value would translate into institutional respect. That adults in leadership positions would recognize nuance. Those facts would matter more than optics. And for years, nothing dramatic happened to challenge that belief. Small frustrations? Yes. Occasional credit misplacement. The familiar experience of explaining a risk, being overruled, then being asked to fix the fallout quietly. But nothing explosive. I was the one people forwarded emails to with, "Can you handle this?" And I always did. In retrospect, that may have been the first mistake. Because when you become the person who handles things, you also become the person who can absorb blame. You don't react strongly. You don't escalate. You don't defend your ego publicly. You fix, and over time, that becomes your identity in the organization. The shock absorber, the buffer between ambition and reality. No one asked whether I wanted that role. It was assigned subtly, through repetition, through who got looped into which conversations, through who was present when decisions were made, and who was informed afterward. To them, I was steady, replaceable in theory, reliable in practice, not threatening, not political, not someone who would ever disrupt the story, and that assumption, more than any single mistake, set the stage for what happened next. Because when the company needed a reason for losing millions, they didn't look at the loudest voice in the room. They looked at the quietest one who wouldn't fight back. Or at least that's what they thought. Looking back, I can trace the shift to something almost forgettable. It wasn't a scandal. It wasn't a shouting match. It was a sentence. We were in a strategy meeting about expanding into a new enterprise segment. Sales had identified a high-profile client, large, global, complex, the kind of logo that looks impressive on a homepage. The CEO was energized. The head of sales was practically glowing. I had reviewed the preliminary terms the night before. The scope was aggressive. The integration timeline was unrealistic. The penalties for underperformance were severe. And buried in the contract was a clause that shifted liability for third-party implementation delays directly onto us. It wasn't a bad opportunity. It was a high-risk one. When it was my turn to speak, I kept it simple. I outlined 3 operational concerns. I suggested extending the onboarding timeline by 60 days and renegotiating the penalty structure. Not to kill the deal, just to protect the company. There was a pause after I finished, not hostile, just thin. The CEO leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "Victor always gives us the cautious version," he said with a half smile. "That's why we love him." A few people chuckled. It was subtle, framed as praise. But the room had already shifted. My analysis was no longer a strategic input. It was a personality trait, cautious Victor. The head of sales jumped in quickly. "If we hesitate, we lose momentum. This client wants decisiveness." The energy in the room tilted forward. Bold, visionary, urgent. I didn't argue. I clarified that operational feasibility wasn't hesitation, it was sequencing. But I could feel it. My words were being translated through a filter I hadn't chosen. Risk-averse, conservative, protective to a fault. The deal moved forward largely unchanged. After the meeting, one of the product managers patted me lightly on the shoulder and said, "You'll figure out how to make it work." Not, "You were right." Not, "Let's revisit those clauses." Just quiet confidence that I would absorb the complexity. That was the first cut, small enough to ignore. Over the next few weeks, pieces of the implementation began landing on my team's desk. Some of them tied to commitments I hadn't agreed to. Custom reporting dashboards, accelerated training sessions. Additional compliance documentation was promised during late-stage negotiations. When I flagged discrepancies between the signed contract and what had been verbally promised, I was told, "We need to be flexible. This is how big deals work." Flexibility, I've learned, is often a one-directional expectation. I worked late more often that month. So did my team. We restructured vendor timelines, reassigned internal resources. I shielded my analysts from executive frustration, taking calls myself when deliverables slipped due to unrealistic assumptions. Publicly, the narrative remained triumphant. Landmark partnership, strategic expansion, major revenue unlock. Privately, we were compressing 6 months of infrastructure into 3. At one point, I sent a detailed memo outlining emerging risks, specifically referencing the liability clause I'd mentioned in that first meeting. I recommended a proactive conversation with the client to recalibrate expectations before we hit a breach threshold. The response from leadership was brief. Let's not alarm them prematurely. Alarm, that word stayed with me. Weeks later, when the first integration delay occurred, caused by the client's own third-party vendor, we were technically in violation. The penalty window activated automatically, and in the executive recap meeting, the language began to shift. Operational oversight, timeline mismanagement, execution friction. The phrases were still soft, still exploratory. No one pointed at me directly, but I recognized the tone. It was the same tone used months earlier when my concerns were framed as caution instead of strategy. That was when I understood something important. The first cut isn't the accusation. It's the reframing of your competence as a limitation, because once that narrative exists, it becomes easy to attach consequences to your name, even if you weren't the one who made the decision. I didn't react, I didn't escalate, but I started remembering everything. After that first deal, something subtle settled into place. No one announced it, no one voted on it. But the tone around me changed in a way that was almost impossible to call out without sounding defensive. I became the qualifier in the room. Whenever I spoke, someone would translate. If I said, the timeline needs to be revisited, it became, Victor's concerned about bandwidth again. If I said, we need to document this commitment formally, it became, let's not get bogged down in process. My language was structural, theirs was emotional, and emotion moves faster. At first, I assumed it was just scaling pains. We were growing quickly. New executives were coming in from larger companies, bringing with them sharper suits and louder communication styles. Compared to them, I probably did look conservative. So, I adjusted. I shortened my comments. I led with solutions instead of warnings. I made my emails tighter, with more bullet points and fewer paragraphs. I tried to meet in the room where it was. It didn't change much. The interruptions became more frequent, not aggressive, just confident. The kind that signals, I've already understood your point, even when they hadn't. In one meeting, I was outlining the operational cost of a pricing discount that sales wanted to offer. Halfway through my sentence, the CFO cut in. We can optimize that later. Right now, growth is the priority. Optimize later. Later, of course, would land on my desk. I nodded. I always nodded. Not in submission, but in acknowledgement that arguing in that moment wouldn't change the vote. That's the thing about normalization. It doesn't feel dramatic. It feels efficient. You tell yourself you're choosing your battles. You tell yourself you're protecting your team from friction. You tell yourself that long-term credibility is built through composure. And maybe that's partially true.
But there is a cost.
Over time, my presence in meetings shifted from contributor to validator. I was asked to confirm the feasibility after decisions had already been made. Victor, we can make that happen, right? The question wasn't genuine. It was rhetorical. If I said yes, I was a team player. If I said no,
I was abstracting in the
there's a narrow hallway between those two labels, and I walked it carefully. I rationalized my silence as maturity. I had a mortgage, a team of 12 people who depended on me. Escalating conflict with the executive team didn't serve anyone, so I documented quietly instead. Every commitment made in a meeting, I followed up with a summary email. Every deviation from the original scope, I archived. Not out of paranoia, out of habit. I'd learned early in my career that memory is flexible, but written records are not. Still, I didn't see myself as preparing for anything. I believed the system would self-correct. That is when friction accumulated, leadership would trace it back to its source and recalibrate. But something else was happening beneath the surface. Because when small dismissals repeat often enough, they reshape how others see you. New hires began mirroring the tone set by executives. In cross-functional meetings, I noticed younger managers explaining operational basics back to me, carefully, politely, as if I needed context. It wasn't malicious, it was cultural drift. I had become the steady background presence, the infrastructure, essential but not directional. And infrastructure doesn't get defended in public, it gets adjusted, replaced, blamed when something cracks. The dangerous part wasn't the disrespect itself, it was how normal it started to feel. I stopped expecting credit. I stopped anticipating real debate. I focused on protecting the integrity of my department and let the rest flow around me. If I'm honest, part of me believed that restraint was strength. That was when things eventually strained under their own weight. My consistency would stand out by contrast. What I didn't fully account for was this. When a narrative quietly forms about who you are in a company, it doesn't require evidence to activate. It just needs a moment of pressure. And pressure was coming. I could feel it building in quarterly targets, in investor expectations, in increasingly aggressive forecasts that ignored operational math. But I told myself what I'd always told myself. Stay steady, stay precise, stay professional. Noise burns out, structure remains. I just didn't realize how quickly structure can be sacrificed to protect noise. There's a moment in every organization when you realize you're no longer just doing a job. You're performing a role. Not the one on your contract, the one people unconsciously cast you in. For me, that realization came during a leadership offsite. 2 days at a boutique hotel outside the city. Glass walls, branded notebooks, catered optimism. The agenda was ambitious. 3-year vision, expansion strategy. Acquisition targets, big thinking, big language. I was there because operations touch everything. That was the justification. But I wasn't there to shape the vision. I was there to validate its feasibility. The pattern became clear midway through the first afternoon. The CEO would sketch an aggressive goal on the whiteboard. Revenue doubling, international rollout, new vertical integration. The room would light up. Then someone would turn to me. Victor, what would it take to operationalize that? Not, Victor, do you think we should? What would it take? The assumption was built in. The decision had already been emotionally made. My role was to translate ambition into logistics. Reliable, useful, invisible. At one point, I carefully outlined the infrastructure investment required to support a proposed acquisition. New compliance systems, expanded support staff, regional legal consultations. It wasn't a rejection, it was a realistic assessment. The CEO smiled in a way that was meant to reassure the room. That's why we have Victor, he said. He'll build the engine while we drive. Everyone nodded. It sounded complimentary. It even felt complimentary for a second. But then it settled differently. Engines don't choose destinations. They don't question the driver. They don't get credit when the car arrives somewhere impressive. They just run. That was the role. In hindsight, I had been slowly stepping into it for years. Saying yes when timelines were compressed. Absorbing fallout when forecasts missed. Quietly correcting errors introduced upstream without escalating them publicly. I had trained the organization to expect resilience without resistance. And organizations, like people, rarely challenge what benefits them. The role expanded beyond meetings. When conflicts arose between departments, I was asked to mediate, not because I was neutral, but because I was stable. When executives needed difficult messages delivered to staff, budget constraints, restructuring, delayed bonuses, it often came through me. I became the buffer. And buffers are designed to absorb impact without visible damage. There's a strange loneliness in that position. You're close enough to leadership to understand strategic tension, but far enough that you're not part of the core trust circle. You carry responsibility without narrative authority. I started noticing how often decisions were finalized in conversations I wasn't part of. Deals verbally agreed to over dinners. Scope changes discussed in private Slack threads. By the time I was looped in, the language had already shifted from possibility to commitment. Victor will adjust. Ops can handle it. Let's keep momentum. Momentum is a powerful word. It makes caution sound like sabotage. And because I rarely pushed back publicly, the assumption hardened. I wouldn't. Not because I was incapable, but because I was predictable. That predictability became my defining trait in the executive mind. Not my analytical precision. Not my ability to forecast risk. Just steadiness. I don't think anyone consciously decided I should be the fall guy if something major went wrong. It doesn't work like that. Instead, the ecosystem evolved in a way where responsibility flowed downward and visibility flowed upward. Strategic wins climbed, operational friction settled, and I accepted it longer than I should have. Part of me believed this was just the cost of maturity. That not every contribution needs applause. That leadership sometimes means carrying weight quietly. But there's a difference between humility and erasure. At that off-site, during a break between sessions, I stood by the window overlooking the lake. The executives were laughing near the coffee table, talking about valuation projections. I wasn't excluded, no one pushed me away, but I wasn't inside the current either. That's when the clarity formed, not as anger, but as observation. I had been assigned a role that made the company stronger, and made me expendable. I just didn't yet know how expensive that assignment would become. The shift didn't happen in the all-hands meeting. It didn't even happen the day penalties from that enterprise deal officially hit our books. It happened on a Tuesday morning at 6:40 a.m., alone in the office. I prefer arriving early. The building feels different before the noise begins. Lights hum softly. The city outside is still deciding whether it wants to wake up. There's clarity in that quiet. I had my coffee beside me, and a spreadsheet open on my screen, the latest financial reconciliation tied to the enterprise account. The numbers were no longer theoretical. The liability clause had activated. The penalties were real. And the total exposure was climbing faster than leadership had forecasted. I wasn't shocked by the figures. I had warned about the clause months ago. What caught my attention was something else. In the internal deal summary archived in our system, my name appeared under operational approval. I stared at it for a long time, because I had never approved the final structure of that contract. I had reviewed an early draft. I had flagged concerns. I had sent written recommendations suggesting revisions. But the final negotiated version, with the liability language intact, had been closed during a late-stage executive call I wasn't invited to. Somewhere between draft and signature, my role had been rewritten. The entry wasn't maliciously obvious. It wasn't bolded or exaggerated. It was simply positioned, as if I had signed off, as if the risk transfer had passed through my authority. I checked the timestamp. The metadata showed the summary had been edited 2 days after the contract was finalized. The edit history wasn't detailed enough to reveal who made the change, only that it had been updated. I leaned back in my chair. For years, I had trusted that while I might be sidelined strategically, documentation would remain accurate. That even if narratives drifted, records would hold. Now I wasn't so sure. That morning, I opened every related email thread. I reread my own memos. I scanned the attachments. Not defensively, not angrily, carefully, and the pattern emerged with uncomfortable clarity. Each time I had raised a concern, the language in executive responses had softened or redirected it. Each time I had suggested renegotiation, the decision had been deferred for relationship reasons. Each time I had outlined potential exposure, the risk had been framed as manageable. And yet in summary documents and recap decks, operational sign-off was implied. Not explicitly stated, implied. The distinction matters, because implication creates deniability. That was the moment something inside me adjusted. Not rage, not fear, alignment. For the first time, I understood that staying silent wasn't neutrality. It was consent to a story I wasn't writing. I had believed professionalism would protect me, that thorough documentation and steady performance would insulate me from distortion. But professionalism without visibility is fragile. Sitting there in the early morning light, I realized something else. No one in that building saw me as a threat. They saw me as infrastructure, stable, replaceable. And infrastructure doesn't defend itself. If the financial fallout escalated, and it would, there would be pressure from investors, from the board, from the media if it reached that scale. Pressure needs a point of release. And the quiet, reliable operations lead who had approved the deal was an easy outlet. I closed the spreadsheet. For the first time in my career, I asked myself a question I had avoided. If they decide this is my fault, what proof will I have that it isn't? The answer, thankfully, was enough. But proof only matters if you're willing to use it. That Tuesday morning, before the office filled, before Slack notifications began lighting up my screen, I made a quiet internal decision. I would stop assuming good faith where incentives didn't align. I would stop absorbing narrative drift. I would stop being the engine that never questions the route. I didn't confront anyone that day. I didn't send a defensive email. I simply began paying attention with a different intention. And once that intention shifts, everything looks different. After that Tuesday morning, I didn't become louder. I became deliberate. From the outside, nothing changed. I still showed up early, still ran cross-functional meetings, still delivered quarterly operational reports with the same clean formatting and measured tone. But internally, the posture shifted. Before, my silence had been reflexive, a byproduct of temperament. I avoided unnecessary friction because I valued efficiency and stability. Now my silence had intent. In meetings, when ambitious projections were floated without operational grounding, I no longer rushed to soften the landing. I asked precise questions and let the answers hang longer than usual. What assumptions are we making about client-side implementation capacity? How are we pricing liability in this structure? What's our mitigation plan if the onboarding window slips? I didn't challenge aggressively. I didn't roll my eyes. I didn't raise my voice. I just stopped cushioning the weight of their decisions. The room reacted subtly. Where I had once been seen as cautious, now I was described as methodical. It's interesting how the same behavior earns different labels depending on context. But something else happened too. When executives overcommitted in meetings with clients, I stopped informally patching the gap afterward without documentation. Instead of quietly solving discrepancies, I followed up in writing. Per the call, we committed to X. To clarify, this would require Y additional resources and Z timeline adjustment. Please confirm. Confirmation is a powerful word. It forces ownership. At first, the responses were casual. Yes, understood. We'll make it work. Let's discuss offline. But offline discussions leave no record, so I began summarizing those too. Following up on our conversation earlier, aligned that I wasn't building a case. I was restoring accuracy. There's a difference. My team noticed a change before leadership did. In one of our internal check-ins, my senior analyst asked, "Are we escalating more these days?" I paused before answering. "No," I said.
We're clarifying,
Clarity protects morale. It prevents burnout that stems from absorbing unrealistic demands. And I had spent years shielding them from that strain by taking it on myself. I stopped doing that quietly. When timelines were compressed, I didn't automatically volunteer overtime solutions. I presented trade-offs. We can hit this date if we deprioritize Project B, otherwise we extend by 3 weeks. Trade-offs make ambition tangible. Some executives were mildly irritated by the increased friction. Not openly, but in tone. Meetings felt slightly less fluid. Momentum encountered measurable surfaces. But no one accused me of being difficult, because everything I said was reasonable. That's the power of calm precision. Meanwhile, the financial impact of the enterprise deal continued unfolding. Penalties accumulated. Client dissatisfaction grew as their own vendors delayed integration. Revenue projections tied to the deal had already been communicated externally. Pressure was rising. I could feel it in shorter executive tempers, in more frequent quick sync meetings, in the CFO's increasingly tight-lipped expressions during financial reviews. And through all of it, I maintained composure. I didn't reference the liability clause in every conversation. I didn't remind anyone that I had flagged it early. I didn't say, "I warned you." That would have been emotional. Instead, I began organizing information, contracts, email threads, meeting summaries, version histories. Not obsessively, systematically, because silence, when chosen, creates space. And in that space, you can see the structure of a system clearly. The truth was simple. If the company needed a narrative to explain the losses, the groundwork had already been laid to point toward operations. Execution friction, timeline oversight, approval implied. If that moment came, arguing reactively in an all-hands meeting wouldn't matter. Public perception calcifies quickly. Preparation, not protest, would determine the outcome. So I prepared, not to attack, not to humiliate, just to ensure that if my name was spoken in a room as the reason millions were lost, I would not rely on memory or emotion to respond. I would rely on the sequence, because the sequence doesn't shout. It doesn't accuse, it simply reveals. And once revealed, it's very hard to argue with. The company still saw me as steady, predictable, non-confrontational. They mistook that steadiness for passivity. They mistook documentation for routine diligence. They mistook my quiet for comfort. They didn't realize it had become a line. Preparation doesn't look dramatic from the outside. It looks consistent. In the months leading up to the all-hands meeting, I didn't hire lawyers. I didn't make threats. I didn't signal distress to colleagues. I refined my awareness. The first thing I did was reconstruct the timeline of the enterprise deal from first contact to penalty activation. Not emotionally, chronologically. I mapped meetings, email threads, Slack summaries, contract revisions, and approval checkpoints. When you lay information out sequentially, something interesting happens. Narrative gaps become visible. There were clear inflection points where risk had been acknowledged verbally, but deprioritized strategically. There were moments where liability was consciously accepted in exchange for speed. There were edits to summary documents that subtly reallocated responsibility without altering formal authority lines. None of it was illegal. None of it was dramatic. But it was directional. I also started paying attention to board dynamics. Not confidential details, just patterns. The kinds of questions investors were asking during quarterly reviews. The tone shifted when revenue forecasts were discussed. The way the CEO framed setbacks, externally focused, rarely internal. Language reveals pressure. I requested access to historical board decks under the justification of aligning operational reporting with executive messaging. It was a reasonable ask. Inside those decks, I noticed something subtle but important. The enterprise deal had been positioned as a strategic accelerator, an example of bold leadership and market expansion. The operational complexity was mentioned only in high-level bullet points. Optimistic framing isn't unusual, but optimism creates expectations. And expectations, when unmet, demand explanation. Quietly, I began strengthening my professional network outside the company. Not to leave immediately, but to ensure optionality. I reconnected with former colleagues now in compliance, corporate law, and enterprise risk roles. Casual conversations, industry updates, nothing urgent. Optionality changes how you carry yourself. When your identity isn't tied to a single institution, your posture shifts. Subtly, but noticeably. Inside the company, I tightened internal processes. Not restrictively, just clearly. Scope approvals required written confirmation. Vendor adjustments required documented acknowledgement from executive sponsors. Implementation changes were time-stamped and archived with clarity. A few executives joked about my new love of paperwork. I smiled. Documentation isn't about distrust. It's about memory integrity. The most important preparation, though, wasn't structural. It was psychological. I asked myself a difficult question. If they publicly blame you, can you respond without anger? Because anger weakens credibility. It turns clarity into defensiveness. I rehearsed scenarios in my head, not confrontations, responses. If my name appeared on a slide tied to financial loss, what sequence would I present? In what tone? With what level of detail? I practiced restraint. There's a difference between proving someone wrong and exposing a misalignment. The former is emotional. The latter is factual. Meanwhile, signs of internal strain multiplied. The CFO began asking more pointed questions about operational sign-offs. The CEO grew less patient in meetings when delays were mentioned. Sales leadership, under pressure to maintain growth narratives, leaned harder into optimism. The ecosystem was tightening. And still, no one noticed my shift. Why would they? I hadn't changed my personality. I hadn't become combative. I hadn't leaked concerns or whispered dissent. I simply stopped assuming that fairness was automatic. The final piece fell into place during a routine audit of contract approvals. I discovered that while my name was listed as operational approval in the deal summary, the actual signed authority line on the contract belonged solely to an executive officer. Legally, responsibility was clear. Narratively, it was not. That distinction mattered more than anything, because public perception often follows narrative first, documentation second. If a moment came where those two collided, whoever presented the sequence most clearly would shape the outcome. I didn't want that moment, but I stopped fearing it. Preparation does something quiet to you. It replaces anxiety with structure. And once you have structure, you don't need to shout to stand steady. They never noticed I had stopped being infrastructure. I had become evidence. The confirmation didn't come in a dramatic way. No secret meeting, no anonymous tip, no late-night confession. It came through a routine internal finance review. The CFO had scheduled a cross-functional reconciliation to address the escalating losses tied to the enterprise account. By that point, the penalties and operational overages had compounded into something no one could dismiss as temporary friction. The numbers were no longer abstract. We were looking at a multi-million-dollar impact. The meeting was tight, controlled, no theatrics. When we reached the section of the report labeled Approval and Oversight, the slide displayed a simplified chain of responsibility. Sales lead, executive sponsor, operational approval. My name again. The CFO didn't accuse me directly. He didn't need to. The slide structure did the work. It implied a sequence. It implied endorsement. It implied that operational risk had been assessed and accepted. I felt the familiar stillness settle in my chest. Instead of reacting, I asked one question. Can we pull up the executed contract signature page? There was a pause, not uncomfortable, just slightly inconvenient. The document was retrieved. The signature line appeared on screen. Only one executive officer's name was there. No operational co-signature. No secondary approval. Silence lingered for a moment longer than usual. The CFO adjusted his glasses. Right. Formal authority sits there. He said evenly. Formal authority. The phrase was careful. I nodded. Understood. For clarity, my role was advisory. I flagged the liability clause in the draft phase. I didn't emphasize it. I didn't lean forward. I simply stated it as a fact. The room shifted almost imperceptibly, because the implication in previous summaries had blurred that distinction. Advisory had been translated into approval. Caution had been reframed as clearance. In that moment, the difference crystallized. The CEO, who had been quiet, interjected smoothly. Let's not get caught in semantics. The focus is on remediation. Semantics. It was an elegant deflection. But semantics are structured, and structure determines responsibility. I didn't push further. Not there, not in that room. I didn't need to. The document had spoken. After the meeting, I returned to my office and closed the door. Not out of frustration, but reflection. The private reveal wasn't that I was legally protected. It was that the leadership team knew it. They knew the formal approval chain. They knew where signatures sat. They knew which concerns had been raised and when. And yet, in summary decks and cross-functional presentations, the framing had drifted toward operational oversight. Not accidentally, strategically, because narrative pressure seeks the most absorbent surface. I sat with that realization for a long time. There was no satisfaction in it, no surge of vindication, just clarity. They were preparing an explanation, and I was positioned as part of it, not the sole cause, not the villain, but the operational hinge where ambition met friction. It was subtle enough to defend publicly, vague enough to distribute accountability without confronting executive decision-making. And if the pressure intensified, if investors demanded sharper answers, it would be easy to consolidate that narrative further. I opened my folder of archived documentation and reviewed it once more. Time-stamped emails, draft revisions, explicit warnings, a clear absence of my signature on the executed contract. Everything aligned. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider a possibility I had avoided. They might choose to protect the story of bold leadership by sacrificing the story of operational caution. Not maliciously, not personally, just structurally. That was the private reveal. Not that I had leverage, but they needed me not to use it. And leverage only exists if you're willing to decide what to do with it. That decision was approaching. Once you realize you're being positioned inside a narrative you didn't author, the instinct is to react, to send a clarifying email, to schedule a meeting, to defend your name before it's spoken too loudly. I considered all of that. I drafted messages I never sent. One version was firm but professional, outlining my advisory role in the deal and requesting correction in future summaries. Another was softer, suggesting we align language to avoid misinterpretation. Both were logical. Both would have changed nothing, because the issue wasn't a misunderstanding.
It was a session, yes.
The company had communicated aggressive growth to the board. The enterprise deal had been showcased as proof of visionary expansion. If the financial consequences were traced directly to executive appetite for speed over structure, that story would fracture confidence. But if the losses could be framed as operational execution friction, overlooked risk, timeline mismanagement, the strategic narrative remained intact, painful, but survivable. I understood that calculus, and for the first time, I stopped taking it personally. This wasn't about whether they liked me. It wasn't about whether they respected my work. It was about preserving hierarchy. That clarity simplified my options. Option 1. Confront leadership privately and demand explicit correction before anything is escalated publicly. Risky. It would signal that I saw the drift, and that I was willing to challenge it. That could accelerate the narrative instead of diffusing it. Option 2. Resign quietly before the pressure peaks. Protect my reputation externally by exiting early. Clean, dignified, controlled. Option 3. Stay. Say nothing. Prepare completely. And if the narrative crystallized publicly, respond once, with sequence, not emotion. Option 3 was irreversible, because once you let a public accusation unfold before correcting it, you can't return to comfortable neutrality. The relationship with leadership changes permanently. I weighed the cost carefully. I had invested nearly a decade in that company, built teams, built systems, built trust with staff who weren't part of executive politics. Walking away preemptively would protect me, but staying would expose something larger than my own reputation. I asked myself one final question. If they publicly frame you as the reason millions were lost, and you have the documentation to prove otherwise, what kind of professional do you want to be in that moment? Reactive? Defensive? Quietly resigned? Or precise? The decision wasn't about revenge. It was about integrity. If I left without confronting the distortion, the narrative would solidify. It would follow me indirectly through references, through industry whispers. Strong operator, but struggled with that enterprise expansion. If I confronted too early, I would appear insecure, overly sensitive to language before formal blame had been assigned. So I chose timing. I would not preempt. I would not escalate privately. I would allow the narrative to reveal itself fully. And then I would respond once, calmly, with documentation, with timestamps, with signatures, with sequence. The irreversible part wasn't the exposure. It was the shift in how leadership would see me afterward. No longer infrastructure, no longer absorbent, no longer predictable. They would understand that my silence had never been weakness. It had been restrained, and restraint, once withdrawn, doesn't return easily. I closed my laptop that evening with an unfamiliar sense of steadiness. Not anticipation, not anxiety, just readiness. If they chose to protect the story at my expense, I would not interrupt them mid-sentence. I would let them finish. And then I would speak. After I made the decision to wait, something interesting happened. I became lighter, not careless, not indifferent, just unburdened by the need to correct every mischaracterization in real time. because I knew if the moment came, I would not be relying on memory or emotion. I would be relying on the sequence. In the fecal weeks that followed, I made several moves, none dramatic, none confrontational. First, I formalized my reporting structures, operational risk summaries, which had previously lived as bullet points inside larger decks, became standalone documents, clear headings, explicit risk ownership fields, not accusatory, just structured. Wherever executive sponsorship was applied, it was labeled precisely. Executive sponsor, name. Where advisory input was applied, it was labeled as such. Language matters. Second, I scheduled a routine compliance check with our internal legal advisor. It was framed as proactive housekeeping in light of enterprise expansion. No alarms, no allegations. During that conversation, I asked a neutral question. In our current governance model, how is approval authority formally documented versus advisory review? The answer was straightforward. Approval authority resides with signatory officers. Advisory roles are not binding unless co-signed. I thanked them, documented the clarification, filed it. Again, not building a case, building clarity. Third, I updated my LinkedIn profile, subtly, not with a seeking opportunities banner. Just a refined description of my role. Enterprise risk management, operational governance and contract review advisory. Optionality, reinforced. Inside the company, tension was rising. Revenue adjustments were being forecasted downward. The board had begun requesting more detailed breakdowns of the enterprise accounts underperformance. The CEO's tone in leadership meetings sharpened slightly. Less visionary, more defensive. And then one Friday afternoon, an email landed in my inbox. Subject, all hands. Mandatory attendance, Monday 10 a.m. No agenda attached. That, more than anything, told me what I needed to know. Companies don't call mandatory all-hands meetings without context unless they're preparing to control a narrative. I didn't speculate wildly. I didn't panic. I reviewed my documentation one final time that weekend. Email threads highlighting my early risk flags. Meeting summaries showing liability discussions. The executed contract signature page. The internal deal summary shows my name under operational approval, time-stamped after execution. Everything was clean. I organized it into a chronological folder. Printed copies, digital backups, not to distribute impulsively, to be ready. Monday morning arrived quietly. The office buzzed with low-level anxiety. Slack channels were unusually active. Speculation moved in fragments. Budget cuts, restructuring, investor pressure. I sat at my desk until 9:58 a.m., then walked into the main conference space. Rows of chairs, projector screen glowing blue. Leadership lined up along the front wall. I took a seat in the third row, not hiding, not front and center, neutral. The CEO stepped forward at exactly 10:02 a.m. He thanked everyone for their hard work, acknowledged a challenging quarter, referenced market conditions. Then he transitioned. There's one major factor we need to address directly, he said. A slide appeared behind him. The enterprise client's logo filled the screen, followed by a financial figure, loss exposure, and beneath it in smaller text, operational oversight. Implementation failure. My name appeared on the next slide. Calm font, clean design, no exclamation points, just positioned. For a brief moment, the room felt suspended. No one looked at me immediately. They looked at the screen, because narrative always starts visually. I didn't feel anger. I felt confirmation. They had chosen the story, and now it was my turn to decide how it would end. There's a specific kind of silence that fills a room when blame is assigned publicly. It isn't loud. It isn't chaotic. It's controlled. After my name appeared on the slide, the CEO continued speaking in the same steady tone he used for quarterly wins. We moved quickly to secure this partnership, he said. In hindsight, certain operational controls were not executed at the level required for a deal of this scale. Operational controls, executed, required. Each word is carefully selected to distribute accountability without naming the executive's appetite for speed. He didn't say I acted recklessly. He didn't say I ignored protocol. He simply framed the loss as the result of insufficient operational rigor. And because my reputation inside the company had been built on quiet reliability rather than visible authority, the framing felt plausible. I noticed the body language first. Some people shifted in their seats. A few glanced at me quickly, then away. Others kept their eyes forward, absorbing the narrative being handed to them. No one interrupted. Why would they? An all-hands meeting isn't structured for dialogue. It's structured for alignment. The CEO moved on to remediation steps, new oversight committees, tighter approval pipelines, external consultants to review operational frameworks. Each solution subtly implied a gap had existed. And gaps need origins. When the floor was opened for questions, they were cautious, polite, focused on future safeguards rather than past accountability. How do we prevent similar exposure? What changes are being implemented immediately? No one asked me directly for my perspective. That was intentional. The moment you invite the accused to speak, you risk narrative fracture. The meeting ended with reassurance about the company's resilience, about learning from setbacks, about strengthening processes. People dispersed slowly. That's when the second wave began. Slack messages started arriving almost immediately. "Hey, are you okay?" That seemed abrupt. "Is there more context?" Concern, but filtered through uncertainty. I responded calmly. "Appreciate the check-in. I'll address it appropriately." Appropriately. In the executive hallway, I could feel the shift more sharply. Some leaders avoided eye contact, not out of guilt, out of discomfort. Others offered tight smiles, as if this were an unfortunate but necessary organizational moment. The CFO gave me a small nod, neutral, non-committal. The CEO didn't approach me. That was telling. By late afternoon, consequences began surfacing in practical ways. A temporary freeze was placed on new operational initiatives, pending review. A consultant was scheduled to audit my department's workflows. A follow-up leadership session was added to the calendar to clarify accountability structures. None of these actions was overt punishment. They were structurally distancing. The organization was recalibrating around the narrative just delivered. And here's what struck me most. No one seemed malicious. No one looked triumphant. They looked relieved, because the loss now had a container. It had a slide. It had a name. Uncertainty is heavier than blame. Once blame is assigned, people can exhale, even if they aren't fully convinced. By 5:30 p.m., the office felt different. Conversations quieted when I passed. Not dramatically, just subtly. People were recalculating their proximity to the story. Yet, inside me, there was still no anger, only sequence. I went back to my desk and opened the folder I had prepared. This was the moment I had chosen to allow. The narrative had been publicly set. If I reacted emotionally now, stormed into the CEO's office, sent a company-wide rebuttal, I would validate the framing. Defensiveness looks like guilt when presented against calm authority. Instead, I drafted one email. Short, direct. Subject: clarification request. Enterprise deal oversight. Addressed to the CEO and CFO. I did not accuse. I did not threaten. I requested a formal opportunity to present the documented approval sequence related to the enterprise contract for the sake of record accuracy. And I ended with one sentence. I believe transparency here will strengthen, not weaken, our governance credibility. Then I waited. Consequences had begun. But so had correction. They just didn't know it yet. The reply came the next morning at 7:12 a.m. Short, controlled. Let's discuss before circulating anything broader. It was from the CEO. Not defensive, not dismissive, just contained. A private meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m. Executive conference room. CEO, CFO, me. When I walked in, the tone was different from the all hands. No slides, no projector, no performance. Just 3 chairs and a closed door. The CEO began with composure. "Victor, yesterday wasn't meant to single you out personally." I nodded. Understood. The CFO leaned forward slightly. "The board is pressuring us for structural accountability. We had to demonstrate control." Control. That word again. I placed a slim folder on the table. "I appreciate the need for governance clarity," I said. "Which is why I'd like to walk through the documented approval sequence of the enterprise contract. No edge in my voice, no accusation, just sequence." I opened with the draft review email, time-stamped 3 months before execution, where I explicitly flagged the liability clause and recommended renegotiation. Then the follow-up memo reiterating exposure thresholds. Then the meeting summary was where leadership chose to proceed for strategic positioning. Then the executed contract signature page with sole executive authority. Then the internal deal summary edited post-signature listing me under operational approval. I didn't interpret. I didn't editorialize. I let the document sit between us. Silence is different in a closed room. It has weight. The CEO's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Not anger, but calculation. The CFO scanned the pages again, slower this time. "No one is disputing that you raised concerns," the CEO said carefully. "I'm not asking anyone to," I replied. Another pause. What had been framed publicly as operational oversight now looked structurally misaligned. Not because I argued, because the sequence contradicted the slide. And here's the part that mattered most. They realized it, not emotionally, strategically. Because if I chose to present this documentation beyond this room, to HR, to the board audit committee, even informally to key managers, the narrative would fracture. And fractured narratives invite deeper scrutiny. The CEO exhaled slowly. What are you proposing? Not, are you wrong? Not, how dare you? What are you proposing? That's when I understood something fully. They couldn't reverse the all-hands narrative cleanly. Public retractions raise more questions than initial statements. If they corrected it outright, they would implicitly admit misrepresentation. But if they left it unaddressed, the documentation remained a quiet threat to leadership credibility. Too late to pretend it hadn't happened. Too risky to ignore it completely. So I offered something measured. A follow-up communication clarifying approval structures and decision timelines, I said. Without dramatization, just factual governance alignment. No humiliation. No public dismantling. No emotional reckoning. Just a correction. The CFO nodded slightly. The CEO didn't respond immediately, because this wasn't just about me anymore. It was about optics. If they corrected the narrative, they would weaken the impression of decisive leadership under pressure. If they didn't, they would carry a structural liability inside their own executive team. The tension wasn't loud. It was cold. That's when I felt it shift fully. Not power, not dominance. Leverage. And leverage doesn't shout. It waits. They had tried to consolidate pressure into a single name. Now the pressure was redistributing, quietly. And there was no way to put it back into the bottle without consequence. The all-hands moment had felt definitive, but in this closed room, it became clear. It wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of their uncertainty. Too late to fix cleanly, too visible to bury. And now, the confrontation would have to happen properly. The follow-up meeting with the broader executive team was scheduled for Thursday afternoon. Not an all-hands, not public, just leadership. By then, the emotional temperature inside the company had stabilized. The initial shock had settled into a cautious routine. Consultants were still being discussed. Governance language was tightening in emails. But outwardly, operations continued. When I entered the conference room, there were no raised voices, no visible hostility, just awareness. The CEO opened the meeting. We're here to align on the enterprise deal narrative and ensure internal consistency, he said evenly. Narrative, alignment, consistency, careful words. I didn't wait to be invited to speak, but I also didn't rush. When there was a natural pause, I slid a printed timeline across the table. Clean. Chronological, stripped of commentary. Before we finalize any external or internal summaries, I said, I believe it's important that our documentation reflects the actual decision sequence. No accusation, no defensive tone, just structure. I walked them through it calmly. Initial draft review. Risk flagged. Recommendation to renegotiate. Documented. Strategic decision to proceed. Executive level. Formal authority. Executive signature only. Post-signature summary. Language implying operational approval. I kept my voice steady, almost clinical. When you remove emotion from confrontation, people are forced to engage with content rather than tone. One executive shifted in his seat. Another avoided eye contact briefly. The CFO asked a clarifying question about advisory versus approval roles. I answered directly. The CEO listened without interrupting this time. When I finished, I closed the folder. I'm not contesting that operational execution faced challenges, I said, but the liability exposure originated in strategic acceptance of contractual risk. That distinction matters for governance accuracy. Governance accuracy, not for personal reputation, not faith. Accuracy. The room was quiet for several seconds. Finally, the CEO spoke. No one intended to misrepresent your role. It wasn't an apology, but it was a soft retreat. I understand, I replied. Intent and outcome don't always align. That line landed, because it applied beyond the contract. The head of sales cleared his throat. The board wanted accountability. We had to demonstrate action. And we can, I said calmly. By demonstrating precise accountability, not blame. Blackheed. Precision. The difference is critical. There was no shouting, no dramatic confession, no theatrical reversal, just slow recalibration. By the end of the meeting, it was agreed that a clarification memo would be sent to leadership and board members outlining the formal approval chain and advisory roles involved in the enterprise deal. Carefully worded, balanced, accurate, not an exoneration headline, not a public apology, but a structural correction. As the meeting adjourned, the CEO lingered. When the others left, he looked at me, not with anger, but something closer to reassessment. You could have handled this differently, he said quietly. I did, I replied. No sarcasm, no defiance, just truth. I hadn't exposed them publicly. I hadn't escalated to HR. I hadn't blindsided the board independently. I had confronted the issue where it belonged, in sequence, without heat. That's when something subtle shifted in his expression. For years, I had been predictable, absorbent, contained. Now he understood that my restraint had been voluntary. And voluntary restraint, once recognized, changes the hierarchy. There was no handshake, no dramatic resolution, just a new awareness in the room. They could no longer assume I would carry narrative weight silently. And I didn't need to say anything further to make that clear. The clarification memo went out the following week. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't headline my name in bold or announce an error in the previous all-hands framing. It simply outlined the governance structure of the enterprise deal: advisory review, executive approval authority, and shared implementation challenges. Accurate, measured, controlled. To most employees, it read like administrative housekeeping. To leadership, it was something else. It was a quiet admission that sequence mattered. After that, the atmosphere shifted, not loudly, but permanently. In meetings, I was no longer the automatic validator of ambition. When executives floated aggressive timelines, they asked different questions. What does this require structurally? Are we formally accepting that risk? Who holds approval authority? Language tightened. Ownership clarified, not because they suddenly admired me more, but because the cost of narrative imprecision had been exposed. My relationship with the CEO changed in a way that's difficult to describe without oversimplifying it. We weren't closer. We were clearer. He no longer framed my caution as personality. He framed it as governance. That distinction matters. But here's what surprised me most. I didn't feel victorious. I felt defined. For years, I had operated inside a role assigned by others. Reliable, useful, invisible. The engine, the buffer, the absorber. When that role was threatened publicly, I had two choices: protect it or transcend it. I chose the latter, not by shouting, not by humiliating anyone, not by quitting in protest. By clarifying, there's a specific kind of confidence that forms when you defend yourself without aggression. When you let facts carry weight instead of emotion, it changes how you walk into a room. I stopped sitting 2 seats away from decision makers, not physically, psychologically. I no longer waited to be translated. I spoke in complete frameworks. If I disagreed, I stated it directly, without apology, without tension. And something else shifted internally. For years, I believed that quiet professionalism would naturally earn protection. Now I understand that professionalism requires visibility to survive. Documentation matters. Sequence matters. Authority lines matter. But so does the willingness to step forward when narrative drifts. I'm still calm, still measured, still not the loudest voice in any room. But I am no longer infrastructure. I am an agency. If I left the company tomorrow, my reputation would not hinge on a single slide in a single all-hands meeting. It would rest on the way I handled pressure when it tried to define me. And perhaps most importantly, my team saw it. They saw that correction doesn't require confrontation with heat. That integrity can be assertive without being explosive. That clarity can shift power dynamics more effectively than anger ever could. The company continues. The enterprise account eventually stabilized under renegotiated terms. Governance tightened. Processes improved. But something irreversible happened in that conference room. Not to the company, to me. I no longer wait for recognition. I establish boundaries, quietly, consistently, without spectacle. Because dominance isn't about overpowering a narrative. It's about refusing to let one be written for you. When I look back at that all-hands meeting now, I don't replay it with anger. I replay it with perspective. At the time, seeing my name on that slide felt like a line being drawn without my consent. A clean narrative constructed in real time. Millions lost. Operational oversight. Implementation failure. It would have been easy to react emotionally, to defend myself publicly in that moment, to let humiliation trigger confrontation. But here's what I've learned. The loudest response is rarely the strongest one. What protected me wasn't outrage. It wasn't alliances. It wasn't luck. It was a sequence. It was years of documentation. There was clarity about authority lines. It was the decision to let the narrative fully reveal itself before correcting it. Most people think power is about speaking first. It isn't. Power is about speaking last, with evidence. There's a quiet dominance in restraint, in allowing others to commit to a version of events, and then responding with precision instead of heat. I didn't destroy anyone's reputation. I didn't escalate beyond the room where the distortion began. I didn't humiliate leadership publicly. I corrected the record, and in doing so, I redefined myself, not as a reliable engine, not as the operational scapegoat, not as the quiet absorber of ambition, but as someone who understands that integrity is active, not passive. The company survived. The executives adapted. Governance improved. Life moved forward. But the deeper lesson stayed with me. If You allow yourself to be consistently invisible, someone else will eventually decide what your visibility looks like. And when that moment comes, you will either react or reveal. So here's the question I want to leave with you. If someone publicly attached your name to a failure you didn't author, would you defend yourself immediately? Or would you wait, prepare, and respond with something undeniable? I'm curious how you would handle it. Let me know in the comments.
Cảm ơn các bạn vì đã theo dõi đến cuối. Đừng quên ấn like, share và bật chuông để không bỏ lỡ những video mới nhất nhé. Hẹn gặp lại.